Good morning, everybody. This is Carol Mahoney. You've joined the EDM Council update webinar. We're going to give a few minutes, as we always do, for people to join the line. So please bear with us just for 2 or 3 minutes while people are joining. Just a word of housekeeping as well. As a standard default, the webinar session puts everybody onto a mute status. If you've dialed in through the phone, I can release your number because normally there's not a lot of background noise. But if you're on via IP, voice over IP, that does often cause a lot of background noise. So your phone line will be on mute. If you want to ask a question, and we do welcome questions, please raise your hand, which can be found within the control panel, and I will then release your line so you can ask questions. Alternatively, you can send questions over the control panel. There is a questions section and there's also a chat section, so feel free to use that. I want to hand over to Mike.
Thank you, Carol. Good morning, everybody. If you've listened to this conversation in New York, London, or Boston, it's relatively the same. I just want to make sure you understand that. There has been a lot of stuff happening quickly. Carol, actually, I have a echo. If at all possible, we can deal with that.
Mike, good morning. John Bottega. Am I causing the echo?
If you're on mic and speakers, it would be best to go on telephone. But right now, there is an echo.
I think it might. It might be you, John, because. Oh,
just happened. All right, I'll mute myself.
And I will mute myself as well.
All right. So is that any better? There you go. Thank you, John. All right. So this is actually the result of 9 cities in 5 weeks. All of them, of course, have been slightly different, whether it been the spin on the discussion or the accent of the people speaking. We've been sitting in meetings with the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision participants for risk data aggregation. We've been talking to both the banks and the regulators, and it's even we were invited down to speak at South by Southwest so that we could kind of talk to the youth of America about wonderful things such as Ontology. So all great. My goal is to give everybody an update on what's going on. I'm going to start with a little bit of context. I'm going to spend some time on RDA and what it means. We're going to focus in on derivatives, kind of the front line of data management. I'm going to talk about what's going on with OFR and what's going on with the OFR's activity globally, including our advisory committee work. We're going to talk about our maturity assessment methodology and what we've been doing with John Bottega. And then I'll tell you about FIBO. And in fact, FIBO just concluded a technical meeting with OMG last week, so some new developments that I'll add to that are not on these slides. All right, so with that, let's kind of look at this as the overall context from which to evaluate the activities that are underway within the data management industry. And I did this after a couple of meetings in Basel with a couple of regulators, trying to make sure that everybody got the idea of what we're talking about in context. So at the bottom of this chart, of course, you see data. It comes in, lots of data. We know what kind it is, but generally we're talking about reference and pricing and position and corporate action related data, data that relates to the obligation you hold in your transaction process. Underneath that is this important layer, I call it a transport layer, and it includes the developments that are going on within the web, the release of 3.0, lots of functionality embedded in that. They are moving toward a semantic web, and we're all moving toward a semantic environment. So this is really actually critical, even though it's external to the financial industry. And then right above that are the 2 things we care about. There's the messaging layer, right? How the data gets communicated across and around and between the organization. And most of this is about XML schemas. Carol, there's an echo again, unfortunately. And then the other side of next to messaging is digital namespace management, location. So the real challenge for big data, if you will, in this environment is where all this data resides. And as we migrate to the web, all of it is going to reside eventually as a URL or a URI within the underlying web framework. So we need to understand that that underlying foundation is what we're going to operate off of. Above that is the data management kind of mandate. And I divide it, just look at the top two boxes, I divide that up into two big challenges. The first one on the left side, that's data quality. It's the goal. It's what we're all working for. But of course, there's no such thing as data quality. Data has many dimensions of quality, and you see them listed here: completeness, coverage, accuracy, consistency, etc. And all of that has to be looked at in light of the application. So what does it mean to be fit for purpose? And underneath that is all we do to try to manage the quality, from its profiling and cleansing to aligning it with business rules and our QA testing. And that's all the work that we're all trying to do, is just to ensure that data can be delivered in a trusted way to users so they can understand what they get without reconciliation, what we've been calling the prime directive. And then on the right side, we call it map to common meaning, because the goal now is, generally data is of good quality around the industry. The big problem that I notice is that it doesn't align and compare, and when you do manufacturing, you're manufacturing it based on different orientations of data. So the real goal is to make sure that all of this data aligns to an underlying meaning based in law, based in contracts, that allows for us to understand with precision exactly how this data element was created, what it's used for, and how it compares to something else. Underneath that are kind of the three pillars of how you manage that. On the left side is the repositories in our organization, whether they're dictionaries or glossaries or metadata strategies or ontology. This is the requirement here is to ensure that all the data aligns to common meaning, right? That's the essence of all of this stuff, is data has to align to common meaning, understood in the context of the complexity of the industry with which we are operating. In the middle, of course, is unique and precise identification. I think we all get that joke. It's identification of the instruments and the entities and the obligations and the relationships, and all of that needs to be precisely defined and aligned with the role performed in the transaction. And then over here on the right side is really the key to the future, and that is taking all of this infrastructure and harmonizing it in a semantic environment. So I am now a full-born believer that the pathway to knowledge representation goes through the use of the web ontology language and the ability to unravel content from format, from structure, and take advantage of all of the capabilities of being able to do that inference processing no longer hooked to the database. I'm not going to go into that much, although I would love to. I think it is the most important thing for everybody to pay attention to. But this blue area is what I call the underlying data component of our data management infrastructure. Above that, and this now assumes that you have your environment in a semantic model, there are a bunch of query tools, and they're all good, and they allow you to extract data from wherever it resides in Sparkle and natural language, and all of that basically has enhanced our capability to do analysis over linked data sets. And that's the key, right? Because the future is about looking at data from multiple dimensions and being able to create links and relationships on the fly, on ad hoc, on demand, by scenario. And you're going to hear me say that multiple times in this discussion. And then above query is what we are analyzing. So this is kind of the baseline of our databases, not very deep, right? Instrument, entity, transaction, and holding. The processes that we go through from issuance to retirement, and mostly kind of the big four analytical inputs. And most of the analysis that we do is derived from these four big ideas. One is state contingent cash flow. That's the essence of the financial industry. How does the cash move given whatever circumstances exist? That's what we mean by state contingent, and understanding the cash flow as a result of the contractual structure is the name of the game. In addition, you have to understand ownership and control, who's linked to who and who's obligated to do and who owns who and do I get paid before you. That is matched to your obligation, and these are your legal obligations, and those of course are derived by your role, because your role determines what you are responsible for rather than what company you are and what you're holding in your book. And if you look at cash flow, ownership, obligations, and positions, you have the building blocks for all of this scenario-based analysis and the ability to understand underlying links and relationships. And if you look at that together, that's the data management infrastructure. And then there's two important things to keep in mind, and that is the governance challenge, right? So on the left side of the equation is the new data management governance, the new kid on the block. We're all trying to figure out how to get these concepts embedded into large political organizations and get people to behave and to follow data policy and all the challenges that you're all dealing with. And then the other side is, and let's not forget, there is already existing governance infrastructure that exists within an organization, whether it's a technology infrastructure or an operational infrastructure, and you've got to be able to align with how they operate as well. So you can't rip and replace. You're going to have to work with what exists and migrate toward a common view. And if you look together, that's the challenge that we're all standing at, not what, this is what we have to do, not how we have to do it. All right, so let's keep that in mind in the back of your head, and I'm going to go through all of the things that are driving us to implement this infrastructure with precision, standards-based, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So the first thing I think everybody is aware of is the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision released their risk data aggregation principles. It's known as BCBS 239. Forgive me, I wrote this for the people in London. That's what they call it. We call it RDA, and the Canadians call it radar, but it's all basically the same stuff. There were three developments that were critical to this. Right after the crisis, what we all learned was we're having a trouble modeling contagion. And what I mean by contagion, it's the links, relationships among and between, who finances who's obligated for what, how do these instruments work, what am I obligated to do, who do I guarantee, all of that ability to understand the interconnectedness of our industry. That was the data problem that we all experienced as a result of the crisis. In 2010, the Senior Banking Supervisors Group did a report, a study based on this concept. They came out with a strange label on it, but it was correct. And it established in the minds of everybody this intractable relationship between data and risk. And it defined what we all now talk about as a control environment. And it did it very well. The problem was this was a concept release, not a regulatory rule. So it was just planting the seeds in the mind of the industry for feedback and get everybody aligned on a concept. And that concept was then expressed as the RDA principles, or BCBS 239, that basically took the concepts of the Senior Banking Supervisors Group and made them mandatory. And for us, we divided up the world into a governance mandate, a content infrastructure or data harmonization mandate, and a data quality mandate. I'm going to go through those in a moment. But that's the context of which to understand BCBS 239, maybe the most important piece of regulation right now for data in the financial industry that we can think of. So after they released it and all the banks got it and freaked out a little bit, they did they were ordered to do a self-assessment. They did a self-assessment. The results of the self-assessment were looked at and analyzed. Basically, they said, all right, we get it. We understand. This is important. We're committed, and banks were committed to fixing the problem. However, banks aren't doing a very good job. They're trying to implement politics and strange organizations, and they're doing lots and lots of reconciliation and workarounds that is not sufficient for what's required to understand risk aggregation in the midst of crisis. And in particular, they called out three things. The first one, they called it Upgrade Risk IT Systems. They mean data. They do not mean your IT system. They mean your data infrastructure. And the goal here is harmonize on meaning across the life cycle. It's a common theme throughout every bit of BCBS 239 and with every bit of the other regulations that are going on. That's the key. They also said improve data quality. And if you really think about it, it's not that the data is bad. It's that the ability to align the data, extract it from reports, have it comparable across the production process, recompound it in what they call adaptable or scenario-based environments is not possible, right? We're living in these silos. The data doesn't align. We can generate reports, but we can't use the data in the way that it's needed to be used. And they call that the data quality problem they're trying to fix. Oh, and by the way, this is a requirement. You have to do it. You have to do it at top of the house, and you have to have ownership implemented. And I'll tell you what that means in a moment. Oh, unfortunately, at the moment, no relief on the crazy deadlines for implementing it, 1 Jan 2016, and no relief that this doesn't relate just to the GSIBs or the big guys. It relates to everybody. And 3 years after identified as a domestically important bank, and that was a year and a half ago, everybody's required to meet against these principles as implemented by their national regulators. The big risk here is if you force the industry to work toward deadline that is not achievable, you're going to force the industry to do tactical. Everybody in our industry can and will comply with their obligations. What we want to make sure is that if we're doing it, let's do it right, and let's make it useful for not only regulators, but for the processes inside of the bank. Specifically, those 3 things I'm going to call out from the self-assessment. Principle 2, that's the data infrastructure principle, basically says you got to implement this underlying language and make it comparable and identifiers, etc. Lowest rating, 70% non-compliant on integrated taxonomies, 60% non-compliant on our ability to do that across production, and the rest of you guys are lying because I know the industry can't do that. Principle 3 is the data quality principle, and remember, this is really now about scenario-based harmonization. Third lowest, 40% non-compliant on alignment across repositories. The rest of you guys are doing it on a manual basis, right? So we're really good at reconciliation, but that's not the requirement. The requirement is to be able to do it in the moment of a crisis and do it in kind of an ad hoc way. And that's what Principle 6 says, the second lowest rating, in that 83%, actually all of you, can't do that in ad hoc requests, right? So we're looking at a push to move us from reporting to analysis, and that's what I think all of this really means. If you dig down a little deeper, and I'll make these slides available, I think they're now posted up on the web. This is the kind of the detail of what they said, and it's not a hugely positive report card, not flexible systems, they're not integrated, lots of manual processes, no common language, fragmented policies, insufficient standards for service level agreement, no measurement criteria. We operate in our independent silos again and again, and you can read through the report. I think this is public, and it says it multiple times, these concepts. Not a good report card. So as a result of that, they've gyrated around a bunch, and they've released a new questionnaire. This is, I think, 2 weeks ago. But really look at this as not a questionnaire to say where you are. This is a questionnaire to say, and here's what we expect you to be. And there really are a couple of critical concepts that relate directly back to the first RDA objective, and that is, kind of the governance principle that says, so I modified this for the Canadians, forgive me, risk, data, aggregation, and reporting is what RDAR means. But you got to have this framework. You got to have it's basically a strategy, and a documented strategy with clear accountability, approved at top of the house, fully resources, fully documented, vetted by stakeholders, aligned with capability. All of that has to be supported by evidence, with all of the limitations understood, known by the top of the house, with the way that you're going to address them documented as the plan moving forward. That's the requirement right there. In addition, they want to make sure that the underlying identifiers and taxonomies are aligned. You know, they cannot unravel and reconcile data from multiple business units and multiple participants. They can't make sense of the data, and they're going to mandate that you first align with an internal standard and then ultimately align with a industry-wide standard across the full life cycle. That means from data attribute all the way up through risk function, and I'll get into that in a moment. And then the third one was data quality, and there's lots of things in data quality, but I divided up really into kind of 4 big ideas. One, separate out risk concepts from data concepts. So the risk ideas need to be understood and created as a dictionary so everybody understands what material breach is and what value at risk might be, and all of the risk concepts need to be defined. All the data needs to be aligned with source. There needs to be an appropriate balance between manual and automated. The goal is to get to automated. The regulators know that manual is required, but you got to be able to justify why this one is manual and what are you doing to validate it and move it quicker. And then all of these components of data quality, right? Off balance sheet, near real time, validated against precise rules, traceable across production, used by real people without the IT skills, and an ability to look at it based on scenarios. That's the requirement. Like it or not, that's what RDA is now saying. As a result of all that, the banks have been getting together, working with us, trying to figure out how we're going to work with the regulators to move forward with this. All of the big GSIBs around the industry have started to come together. We've had a couple of meetings, 2 in New York, 2 in London, 1 in Canada. And underneath that are 6 goals that exist as a result of this conversation. The regulators are sitting in these meetings as well. We've been partnering up with IIF. They're the guys that are dealing with it on the Basel level. They've hired McKinsey. McKinsey is working with us. So it's all kind of a collaborative process right now. Still unclear what the plan moving forward is, given the framework we just described. So the first thing that's required is what we call a shared communication infrastructure. And this is shared by everybody. We've got to make sure common lexicon about risk, about data, about the data management processes. We've got to have things that are ambiguous clarified. We've got to understand what it means to adhere. And I'm using adherence, not compliance. This is really not a compliance task. It is, how is your organization adhering to this on a sustainable level? So the communication goal that we all share, we can work together to get a common lexicon. Second is a governance mandate. Now, this is really a bank's problem, not the regulator's problem. You're going to implement your governance your own way, depending upon your culture. But you can benchmark across the industry, where are you and what best practice looks like. You can align it to the data management maturity model, right? We've extracted from that the 3 or 4 big ideas that you got to establish the program, you got to have documented and approved policy. Policy drives governance. Also standards. Standards are the way you're going to implement it. You got to have your routines and your operating model established, and it's got to be enforceable. It's got to be enforceable both internally and externally. That's the requirement. Your task. They're not going to tell you how to do it, and there's not one way. However, when you start to look at the work that we have to do to get to goal, we're calling this the unraveling the data dependencies, right? There's you start at the end, with the objective, the critical risk functions. Those are reverse engineered to critical measures or calculation processes. Those have to be aligned to business data attributes. Those have to be aligned to authorized data domains. That has to be aligned to your logical and semantic data model. That's got to be aligned to your spaghetti physical infrastructure, and you've got to be able to document, map, and hopefully make simpler the transformation processes that are going. That's the simple work that every financial institution is now faced with doing. Now, once you understand that concept, you got to look at the order in which you might want to approach it. And this is a shared objective with the regulators, right? So as I sit in all of the meetings and the FSOC and ESRB and blah, blah, blah meetings, what comes out are these big concepts again and again, right? Resolution planning, liquidity and counterparty risk. Counterparty risk is really about interconnectedness. Your stress tests, top of everybody's agenda. Mortgage-backed securities is back on the fast track. Derivatives is about complexity and it's about interconnectivity. And then the exposures, whether they be credit, trading, or position, and then the requirements, right? Limit orders and concentration restrictions and things of that. If you unravel these big conceptual ideas down to processes, down to data, down to core data, back to number 3 here, that's the current goal of the task force, to get some agreement on how to do that, how you're going to measure it, make sure that you know what the incremental pathway is and where you are in that cycle. And ultimately, we're going to have to align this data for regulators and banks to use. And again, there's 2 steps here. The first one is a benchmarking, a bank problem, because you're going to align it to your own infrastructure. You're going to use your own standards or a vendor standard. You're going to unravel your own spaghetti, do your own cross-reference mapping to an internal standard. But ultimately, that'll have to be aligned and adopted with the industry-wide standard. And there's an opportunity to work together to make sure that those are created correctly, and that's in process. And I will tell you what's going on there in a moment. That's the kind of the framework of BCBS. I was lucky enough to have an opportunity to work with John Bottega when he was at Bank of America. He took the BCBS principles and just organized them logically in boxes. You can see our 4 boxes. We've got strategy over here on the left. We've got data underneath the bottom. It's risk on top, and kind of your operational infrastructure over here on the right. And all of the boxes have been defined with the bullets of what they mean. We've then aligned this with the DMM, and the DMM basically says, okay, look, these yellow things are really the responsibility of data, and yes, they're all covered within the DMM. These blue things are shared. They're shared either on an organizational level or shared with your IT partners, and then these green things are processes that exist across the organization, and you've got to align with your privacy policies and your security policies and your change management policies and things of that nature. But it gives us all just a way of being able to talk about a big idea and then drilling it down to generally the way financial institutions are structured and operate. The other good news is it then aligns with our DMM, so we know where we can apply the best practice activity. Here is just kind of a diagram view of what we just talked about. You start over on the right side with critical risk functions, and John made a really important point in one of our conversations that there is no such thing as risk data. There are lots and lots of risk functions. Do them independently and then align them together. So you reverse engineer from a risk function to the measurement criteria. That's really a calculation, to your core business entities, to your, hopefully you have your logical domain, and hopefully it's based on FIBO from a standard perspective, and then the spaghetti unraveling back to the physical repositories. That's the task. All right, so that's BCBS 239, and once again, kind of driving the industry forward. But it ain't the only thing in town, because simultaneously with RDA is derivatives transparency. Now, derivatives, even if you're not in derivatives, most important thing to pay attention to, because it is a microcosm of the whole data challenge, and it's the first one out of the gate where it's all this stuff is going to be kind of created. So if you look at what we mean by the derivatives transparency challenge, complexity, lots of customization, lots of links to things, lots of underlyings, many people playing many roles, no standards in place, fragmented trading, and a brand new kind of process being created to move from OTC to on exchange, plus a brand new reporting process. So I sit on the CFTC's Technical Advisory Committee. The last 3 meetings were all about data. The one we just had was the heads of all the business of the commission just getting up there saying, we can't do our task. The data doesn't work. It's not standardized, not aligned to meaning. It's, the taxonomy is not granular enough. We don't like XML schemas. We like meaning. It's all over the place. You can read it yourself. It is not a pretty picture. And I just ran out of room in my note-taking of the things they were saying about the problem with data. And they must solve this problem if they're going to meet their legislative obligation of derivatives transparency. And it's not just the U.S., right? So the global derivative regulators have harmonized under the Financial Stability Board. There's an OTC aggregation working group, all trying to figure out at the same time how to do this. And the one problem they got is data, right? The infrastructure for the exchange, execution facilities and data repositories, et cetera, is in place. The problem is data, and it's a big problem. There's a new concept release coming out of the commission. I think it was published last week, talking about Part 45. That's the data part, looking for any way out of the woods on this. We are working with them to implement a solution to this semantically. Let me get into that in a moment. You also know that the OFR, the Office of Financial Research, part of Treasury, created to look over systemic risk from a data perspective, formed a research advisory committee, 3 parts. There is data people, that's us. There's the risk people, that's the CROs, and there's the finance people, that's the university professors. I run the data committee. We just made our recommendations. These were, I don't know, 2 weeks ago or so. First recommendation related to the legislative obligation that the OFR has to publish an instrument database. The recommendation that came out of the full FRAC was, it's an ontology, guys. The thing that we need to publish is the Rosetta Stone. We need to be able to provide that kind of cross-reference capability so that everybody, once they fix their own shop, can align to common meaning. Use derivatives as your test case to prove it. That's moving on right now. And follow the LEI model. Don't impose a standard. Work with the industry to develop a standard. Unanimously accepted by OFR. Now we're moving to the next phase of what does this mean and how to do it. We also made a recommendation about the reporting process and said that the current process of generating independent print reports based on old formulas and approaches is stupid. And it's expensive, it doesn't give the regulators what they need, they can't unravel them, they can't use them for a scenario-based activity, and it's not working. So let's fix it. Now, the FRAC agreed with this concept, but they sent us back to committee. They said, that's too big. We can't fix that big problem. Go back and break that down into some achievable chunks, and that's what we're doing for that next. The risk guys, they've been focusing on understanding the process. So how does liquidity and collateral actually move in our industry by instrument type and by function? And what they've done is they built these maps that show the flow of process. We're trying to align the data flow within that. And all that said was, it's possible to map this stuff. And OFR, you should be doing that because that's going to give us a common view across the industry. Oh, and by the way, we're already collecting a lot of CCAR data. Can't we figure out a way of using that better? So the concept was agreed. It's moving forward. You need to plan on how to do that. The research guys are focusing on forensic investigation. So when a problem arises, how do you then unravel the implications? And I think some of the goals are to ensure that they have access to that forensic capability. I'm sorry, was there a question? All right, so that's the first kind of deliverable, if you will, out of FRAC. They're just now, we got our operating model together. We've, now we know how to work, and there's some good recommendations on the table. And now we're going to take these recommendations and see if we can help the OFR with their task on implementation. They are moving forward with ontology and with derivatives. It is actually a very exciting activity. I also, because I'm on these committees, get invited to sit in the FSOC meetings. That's the stuff created out of Title I, looking out for the overall systemic risk problem. Mary Miller is the Undersecretary of Treasury for all of our work, right? All of the capital markets and the banks all work under Mary. She's the number 2 at Treasury, and she opens up the conference by saying it's all about data. And then if you look at the 5 things that they really care about, it's, degree of interconnectivity and durability of funding. It's the banking, shadow banking industry, those that are operating without insurance. It is operational risk, number 1 threat to the financial sector according to the OCC. And they're looking at not cyber terrorism, but operational risk from within, right? So it's malware and bad fraud and poor testing and flow of funds, and what happens when you have a partial shutdown and the world cramps up. This is a really scary part of the task that the FSOC has, and they've appropriately defined it and elevated it to number 1. And then you look at the counterparty risk report. This was 5 years after the crisis. The report from the Senior Banking Supervisors Group was, we're not there. And we're not even close to being there. So there's a lot of conversations now underway on the top 50 report and how we improve that. And then you understand about derivatives and complexity. These are the 5 things that the regulators are really looking at. We now have to unravel exactly what they mean from our humble data perspective. All right, so that's not enough regulatory stuff to scare you. I took the key regulatory activities and just lumped them into categories. The first one is transparency related. Of course, it's an overwhelming amount of things, almost all of Dodd-Frank except Title I, European market infrastructure and derivatives. AB2 is about mortgage-backed securities, FACTA, funds, alternative investments. Then there's the systemic risk stuff. Again, nothing small here. Title I, the whole new EU system of supervision, Basel RDA, Basel III, CCAR, solvency, etc. Plus, underneath all of this are a bunch of things trying to ensure that we get an infrastructure built and aligned. So MiFID II is really rising up hot in Europe. CoRep and FinRep on common identifiers and the FSB templates aligned to meaning. So these are maybe the mechanisms that we can use to get this conversation harmonized and aligned in the right way. Okay, so that's all for regulation.
Can I?
Let me just really briefly.
Sorry, Mike. Can I interrupt?
Go ahead.
Would it be a good time just to ask if there are any questions from the audience? If there are any questions, please raise your hand. No, I see none. So, Mike, please continue. Thank you.
That's all right. I needed some water anyway, so thanks. All right. So with all that regulatory stuff as backdrop, and you can equally put that regulatory business case aligned with the obvious logical business case of eliminating reconciliation, removing operational cost, improving your ability to do automated straight-through processing, trusted data into your models, ability to upsell your clients. The ROI from fixing your data right, even if you're doing it because of a regulatory moment, is really to support business operations. And that's the good news about all of this, is that the perfect storm is truly good for business as well. So you know that John Bottega, who was the Chief Data Officer at Bank of America, has left BOA at the end of the year. He is working with the EDM Council full-time at the moment. I have him under contract to take all of this work that we've been doing, our maturity model research, our understanding of best practice, our regulatory goals. And he and I are collaborating to take our collective 50 years of experience and apply it to our best practice documentation of exactly how do you do this. And we've changed our orientation from release of the core model. Right? The core model's been out there, people are using it, it's all great, I got a lot of good feedback. The one thing that we kind of did completely different now with John on board is to align against capability. Exactly what are these process areas and what are the capabilities that are required to meet them? So we needed to define with verification that this is what it means to have a governance program implemented. And that's what we've done. So and we're getting ready to release our draft. But here's an example, right? So we define it up front. We talk about, make sure people understand what this thing is about and why. Big, long narrative. This is for, non-data management people to get a line on understanding what this stuff is, harmonized to, goals. These are top line. Why am I doing this, and what should how should I be looking at it? And then we've done the capabilities, and we'll be making those capabilities available to you shortly, right? So it's also aligned with the methodology that was developed out of CMMI to ensure that it's valid, right? It's really straightforward stuff, right? It's got to be proven. It can't be made up for new. There's a lot of things that are required versus things that are you don't understand. You got to know what you're being measured against, and we're measuring both capability and maturity, so within a process, across process, and then we're adding the capability into that. It's got to be supported by all these things, right? So all these processes have to be supported by policy, using standards, with appropriate resources and training, with clear responsibilities and control over the process and evidence of adherence, right? Exactly the same thing that's in RDA. And remember, it's no one way to do this, and no one is telling any bank how to do it, but they are specifying what needs to be done as unambiguously as possible, supported by evidence, so that you can build from current state to goal. That's the objective of a DMM, and I know we've been doing a lot of work on it. Luckily, John has been doing that full time, and we're getting ready to release that to the industry for comment and feedback. In the meantime, we were working with DTCC. They did a data quality survey, just kind of state of the art. This is real quick what's going on around the industry. It was sponsored by them. Element 22, Predrag Dozdarovic did a lot of the work. Is aligned with our core content model for the DMM. We helped do the analysis. Basically, it says, we underway. It's underway. Good news is people were using the EDM Council's language. That's all good. When I looked through the results, what occurred to me were the characteristics of what does it mean to do it right. And this is not surprising to anybody that it's focused on serving business requirements, mandates, and understanding of the underlying core data attributes based on a full life cycle understanding of the process. Everything's aligned to a single source system. There are business rules. They are documented. They are applied correctly, ideally in an automated way. When there's a problem, it's remediated at source. It's lots of root cause analysis aligned with the core regulatory goals, and make sure that you can integrate into your environments. And while you're doing that, eliminate the redundancies. Make it a simpler environment from the spaghetti that was created over 30 years of acquisition and silo operations, and measure it. And measure it in two ways. Measure it predominantly as is it delivering to business. Then you got to figure out exactly what it means by delivering it to business in terms of breaks or report trust or ability to sell clients or serve clients. Plus, you want quantitative, data conflicts, SLAs, duplicate identifiers, all these metrics, really valuable still to make sure that everybody who now understands the importance of and the requirement to believes that you're actually doing what you need to do in order to fix the challenge. Last year I was asked to give a kind of a summary of all the things that are going on in governance. I'm going to do this relatively quickly. I look at kind of the overall governance framework, and I come up with 3 deadly sins of governance. The first one, of course, is implementing a structure before we actually have alignment in our organization of what it is we're governing. Nothing worse than getting a bunch of top-of-the-house people together, giving them a task to do, and not having agreement on what that task is. You're going to kind of blow your opportunity to get strong governance in. Make sure there's clarity of goal up front. The second sin is the sin of end-user computing. We know that this is real. Like, everybody has to get in the game quickly. This is a time-to-market business. End-user computing tactical approaches are absolutely viable unless they remain as end-user tactical end-of-the-data chain fixes, and then they become intractable. So you've got to be able to figure out how to let them meet requirement, but then unravel back to consistency. And then the biggest one for me is a failure to recognize a boring data is in fact your infrastructure. It's the bricks upon which you build. If you get the bricks wrong, your house is going to fall down. I don't care how much cross-referencing and bodies you can throw at it. With a lot of pressure right now on the building, without having standard bricks that are correctly constructed, it's going to fall down. Within all that, then, I converted it to my 10 principles of sustainable governance. You know, we still got top-of-the-house mandate. You know, this is about politics and getting people to behave. Not possible without top of the house. No matter that there's a lot of regulatory stuff, it's about serving business. It's really the only thing that matters. You got to make sure you can unravel requirements to data to process, because process is critical. We got to understand that this is manufactured product from data factors of input into the compounding process you go through, into your calculation formulas, into your risk models, and into your decision making. So you got to understand that process. Everything can relate down to what's critical. Not everything is critical. Make sure that you know which ones are core for which process and why. That's what you are governing in reality. The development of those core data elements. If you don't get the joke by now, the whole world is built on standards. That's the legacy of the financial crisis. Make sure you adopt whatever you can internally and align that to the industry. Data quality, we've gone through that. It's the goal, but dependent upon what people are doing. The data content orientation is about unambiguous shared meaning. Forget aligning to your data models. Forget aligning and harmonizing nomenclature. It's about getting everybody to understand meaning. And yes, I'm now going to use the O word in polite company. Learn to love it. It's critical. All data elements have got to have a source. Have got to be reference that source, and all copies have to be identical to that source. Not everybody understands this stuff. You're going to have to do a lot of education within your organization. You're going to have to go around being a preacher, preach the gospel about data content management, how it's different from IT management. Make sure people understand data as reflective of an obligation. But because it's foundational, it does lead to collaboration. The good news, in my observation, is that the financial industry is committed to doing the right thing. And people want to do the right thing. When you have a mechanism that brings them together to do the right thing and get out of the data reconciliation nightmare they're stuck in, we see a willingness to do that. So I think there's collaboration internal, collaboration with vendors for easier integration according to standards, and collaboration with market authorities on reporting and oversight. If we do this collaboratively, it will work. We will have our infrastructure. If we don't, it'll be a compliance nightmare, very expensive, and we won't get what we want. You know, we try to track the industry. This is just kind of last year's, 2 years ago, and last year's tracking against the DMM. Just one thing you understand is that we're making the DMM a little different, a little harder. So it's now going to be on capability. So even though 3 is the goal, we're going to crunch this up a little bit, and we're not even close to 3 in the new model, but we're going to be able to do it consistently so you can see where you are. And basically what we look at 3 is you are competent at that capability, and that's really the objective of all of this activity. All right, I got only a few minutes, 10 minutes left. Let me do FIBO. Even though I talk a lot about regulation and other things, DMM measurement, I will emphasize again and again and again, this is the most important thing I've ever seen in my 28 years of tracking the information industry. Every bit of regulatory conversation starts with common financial language. If you get the underlying infrastructure right, you can do the rest of it. If you don't, you can't. There is no question that getting this common financial language implemented and harmonized in your organization is the task. The good news is FIBO is on a fast track. We have lucky to have a great team. Dennis Wisnowski is now taking control over FIBO. We got him from the DoD. He understands process. He's solidified that process. He and Mike Bennett are really now collaborating well. We've hired 2 ontologists to help make progress on this, so we're all really pretty excited about where we are. So here's the top line. First, so FIBO is about 30 domains, all those dependencies and relationships. Most of it has been modeled, but only 2 of them have gone through the full process to go from our model to the web ontology standard that has a stamp of approval all by OMG. So just last week we got the first 2 done. Indices and indicators are next. They're almost done. Even better, we've got a streamlined migration process from our model to RDF OWL. It's now teed up for expedited development. Last week they implemented a process to get more people to help us to move through the mechanism from model to FIBO. So we're very confident that we can kind of expedite that process. We defined the release schedule, defined the dependencies. We got everybody to agree that this is the logical way. I'll show that to you in a moment. I learned this word of syntactic transformation. Basically just means we took our hacked up UML, we converted it to RDFL, we put it into our repository. We're using the adaptive metadata manager, and we've cleaned it up. So now it's in adaptive, in RDF, and clean. Now it's not all validated, and it hasn't gone through the OMG process, but for those of you who are working with inference processing within your organization, this is ready for you to play with. We are going back to doing a lot of SME reviews just to make sure, finally, before we put it to bed as valid. I've got 9 use cases. My message to our members, if you have a use case I want to go through next, that we are interested in making sure that FIBO can do, we are interested in working with you to get some free labor out of this, because we need to make sure that FIBO can be applied in all of the cases where we think it is necessary, and we are trying to do so in collaboration with the community, right? So last year we did a big workshop with academia and with banks and with the semantic community. They all want to play with us, and there are these big 4 tasks that we are kind of working on together. How do we go from the model to an operational implementation? How do we align it with standard business rules? How do we share with accounting and with risk the shared semantics? Because all we're doing is the contract. And how do we align it with visualization tools so you can use the flexibility of semantics in a business in a BI environment, so you can understand the complexity of networks. So all this is our activity. These are the use cases. I'm going to go through them real quick.
Mike, before you do,
yes,
Richard Robinson. Richard, your line is now released. You had a question?
Yeah, Mike, go ahead. Backing up just a little bit on standards, wanted to know, are we differentiating between open or industry standards versus de facto standards that are more vendor owned and controlled?
So two comments, Rich. One is, step 1 is internal alignment, and I'm okay with people using proprietary standards as long as they have the authority to use them and to then model them to the open standards. But the goal is open standards, of which the only ones that the regulators are going to accept are going to be, kind of fully open standards. So two-step process, map to anything, even proprietary, and then cross-reference to open. Is that cool?
Yeah, cool. Just wanted to make sure to differentiate that and make sure people understand the goal is to sort of make sure that inter-company and inter-participants really need to look at the industry open stuff and make sure that we're talking the same languages.
Yeah, and the world is, all of this, I mean, let's be really humble about it. This is just an underlying infrastructure of identification and description of, factual reference data. How do you communicate it across? Those are all open standards. So the world, this baseline stuff, I think, is going to clearly be open standards. And we're moving well beyond anybody saying that the nature of added value is, identifiers or, underlying factual reference data, in my opinion. But we can have that debate. I'd love to have that debate. All right, so use cases. Derivatives is hot for us because it's that microcosm, right? We've got a real live 5.0 implementation showing the intersection of interest rate, credit default, and business rules. We showed that in New York. We're showing that to the regulators. And it's really to do all of their requirements: classify, aggregate, validation, align with the messaging infrastructure, make sure that people can do scenario-based analysis and look at relationships. And it works. And we're happy to show it to anybody who's interested. The other one is repository alignment. Everybody's got lots of multiple repositories. You need to harmonize them up to Rosetta Stone. Many of the banks are looking at 5.0 as the way of using it as a common reference point. We want to make sure that we can map to it. We just saw at the OMG meeting a demonstration of executable business rules. We did Reg W, unraveled Reg W from what does it mean by the lawyers within the banks, took that and made it into a standard business rule process using SBVR. That's another open standard, and aligned all of that to 5.0 to be able to say, am I in compliance with Reg W? And it works. We're happy to show that to anybody. It's a good illustration of, remember, it's language combined with executable business rules that will give you automation. We're working with the Bank of England on mapping some of their concepts to 5.0 so that there is at least consistency of meaning. So this is about regulatory reporting more than liquidity mapping. The mandatory objective is to ensure that we can go from XML schema to Ontology and from relational database to Ontology. We're doing FPML. We now have got some conversation underway with MISMO. The Europeans have come to us and said, do the underlying taxonomy that we're using for co-rep using XBRL, see if we can map that to 5.0. So all of that alignment stuff, it's got to be able to be implemented in real environments. So we're working with the models people to go from our business conceptual to their data model, because we're not in the deployment biz, we're just in the definition biz. Yes, this works. We've seen it happen. OFR we've talked about. And then if you guys are in the UK, pay attention to the what's known as the IBOR. That's the Information Book of Records. It's really about position keeping, and position keeping now is moving from an accounting-based view to a near real-time or snapshot, intraday view. That means they've got to unhook themselves from their accounting systems, and in order to do that, they need an ontology in order to hook it up to their new processes. So a lot of those kind of things seem to be emerging out of the woodworks, and we're looking for all of them. Anyone that meets these use cases, we are interested in talking to you. Dennis Wisnowski is the guy that will be the master facilitator, and we will get some resources aligned and harmonized to make sure that the use case can work. All right, so I got 1 minute or so left. Let me give you what I think all this means before we close, right? So here's my conclusions. Adopt standards, common language, top priority, ain't no doubt about it. Pay attention to 239. The real issue now is if the regulators are going to push against the 1 Jan deadline, we're going to be forced into the do it right versus do it quick debate. That's not going to be good. The future is about scenario analysis, not reporting. You've got to be able to look at things according to contagion or according to any kind of economic scenario. Those scenarios are all about who's linked to who. So if you can just kind of adopt the degree of interconnectedness as the criteria that the regulators are all looking at, that's the problem to figure out. Measure it continually, align it with your processes. Derivatives are the front line. Even if it's not you, this is important for you to pay attention to. There is a knowledge gap. We do have a potential for collaboration. We've got to work together to get everybody kind of talking about this in the same way if we're going to manage a big problem. And even though it's heresy for the Data Management Association to say it, it's not all about data. It's also about process, and you got to understand how data flows and how your organization works. These are the things that you need to pay attention to. Just real quick, this is the scenarios we've done for FIBO. So we've got our domains, our subdomains, dependencies. If you work over from the right to left, initial means not modeled, model means it's been done by us, beta means it's been validated by SMEs, and OMG means it's a standard. There's 2 of them for products. There is 1 of them for processes, and there's 1 of them, one of them for market data, 1 of them for market data, time and statistics. So 2 for products, and this is the way we're looking at the domains and what they relate to and the dependencies. The first goal is to get this foundations through all of these common concepts, including all of bonds and equities, done. I think we're on pathway to get that done, maybe by next quarter if we can push hard. And then we've got to go according to who's squeaking the loudest. Time and date, that's for pricing. Corporate actions, issuance, transactions, holdings, these are all underway, but kind of in first stage. And then this is the process that Dennis has developed, right? The top of it is, we convert it from our model into RDF based on industry requirements. We go through some externality review, which is, does it align with standards? A whole big process of refactoring and correcting and enhancing and, a lot of manual stuff in here that we're trying to simplify. Then some review, did it pass? If not, go back to the process. Then we submit it to OMG. So far, we've been unanimous through OMG once we've got to that process. And then finally, public comments to release the standard. That's the process that exists. There's no getting around it. That's what we have to deal with. So with that, I thank you so much for your time. Sorry, I just kind of had to do a shotgun rattle. I'm available to anybody who wants to dig in deeper to these things. And Carol, I'm free for questions if anybody wants to have any. Anybody has any.
If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. No hands raised.
All right. So with that, thank you all. We'll call this meeting adjourned. Have a great day.
Thank you.